Black the Name by D.B. Halbert. Narrated by the author, D.B. Halbert.
Chapter 5. Fear and Shadows. Buffeting akin to that of a pair of parachutes opening together repeatedly thrums through the air as the gusts seemingly pulse with each vacuous clap. The gate bursts open from the onslaught of waves of the white powder, shaking like paper in the breeze against the stone walls, as if trying to escape from their large hinges to flee from what approaches. Emerging from the confines of the sectioned-off manor causes Elizabeth, Pearl, and Aldrin to bear witness to the screams of a panicking populace, and the cracking of wood as doors and windows shutters slam closed throughout the town, leaving several people locked in the streets, scrambling for shelter. Aldrin takes lead, calling to Pearl over the noise. "We need to get back to the house." "No duh, genius!" Pearl exclaims, attempting to keep pace while pulling Elizabeth along. Weaving through the streets, Aldrin and Pearl pull Elizabeth faster than her legs can easily carry her. But turning a corner, they are stopped suddenly as a high-pitched howl, like that of a hurricane blowing through a deep mountain pass, screams, growing deafening loud for a second before an exploding crash of wood, splintering under an immense force, silences it. Around the corner, in the square beyond, sits the temple of the deities of light and hope, the temple which Pearl and Aldrin's companion Balasar had ventured into to ignite himself, which, with the explosive crash, is crushed under an unfathomably large creature of seemingly pure shadow, almost invisible against the black sky, save a soft glow on the contrasting points of the beast where it would normally have shadow. Standing upon the rubble, the immense figure lifts its black, almost imperceivable, shadowy, scaled head, with 4 large horns piercing from its crown back and away, releasing a roar like that of a dwarven mountain horn warning of an incoming siege. The deep resonance shakes the companions to their core as they freeze, praying that the monster doesn't notice them. Cart-sized head, leveling to look to the manor above beyond Pearl, Aldrin, and Elizabeth, the monster releases in a deep growl, like a low tiger's roar, mixed with a whale's song, a voice which, in emanating, silences all other communication in the town. The dragon, seemingly made of the wispy shadows of this land, stretches like a cat as its wings again unfurl like the sails of an imperial ship, and its talons, like great swords, cut into the wood and stone of the collapsed church beneath it. Barely visible through the strange counter-shadows of the creature's form, shows its powerful muscles ripple under the enormous being's outer scaly flesh, as the long snake-like neck stretches, slithering along the ground from broad, bulldog-like shoulders. With a powerful thrust, the black smoking wings of the dragon push the massive form upward as they fill with air and throw a wave of gusting wind and powder radially out from the destroyed building. As the terrifying, repetitive buffeting returns, sending gusts of wind and dust with each thrust of the wings, the mammoth, shadowy form lifts, disappearing as it raises hundreds of feet into the sky, blending with the black nothingness. The beating of the wings fades from a deafening cracking to the familiar volume of the dragon's approach, moving outward, chillingly quickly, around the outer walls. The hurricane's howl returns as the barely visible distant shape of the winged terror turns in toward the town, directly for the destroyed church. As Aldrin, Pearl, and Elizabeth attempt to cross the square, fighting the intense, prevailing circular wind caused by the enormous form's movement. Like a javelin, the dragon pierces toward the square, gaining speed as it approaches the rooftops. Before striking the ground, the dragon's wings open, turning its downward momentum into horizontal, and with a great exhalation, a gout of black fire spews forth from the maw of teeth like daggers and swords, consuming the entire square and everyone within, just as Pearl, Aldrin, and Elizabeth escape into another street. Through the black flame, which persists for a short few seconds after the dragon passes, the twisted white outlines of those who were caught by the heatless blaze can be seen writhing as skeletal forms within. The blaze dissipates, and within the square each victim is left not skeletons, but heavily decayed corpses, which collapse to the ground. A second passes, and the three outsiders stare at the massacre performed with seeming ease by the gargantuan being. Aldrin and Pearl turn to leave, but before Elizabeth joins them, the bodies begin to move, rising inches off the ground with a black mist that seeps through the cracks in their skin. Still not comfortable with the concept of undeath, Elizabeth becomes panicked, causing her to instinctively reach back, grabbing hold of Pearl's arm, tugging on it to get her attention before vanishing from sight, invisible. Pearl turns in time to see the bodies drop back to the ground, releasing beings of pure shadow that separate themselves from the host which carried and cast them across surfaces whenever they would stand near a light. From a distant alley, 3 arrows leap out, impacting with one of the shadow's chest, piercing completely through, falling directly to the ground on the other side. Pearl looks for the source as the shadow turns and silently expresses, as if screaming to the side alley. The space is empty when Pearl's eyes search the shadows for the shooter, unable to find anyone. The shadows drop, skirting across the ground as they had when their bodies lived, to find the life sources nearby to drain, to Pearl. Next to the startled female, 3 tall, lanky shadow forms rise from their places on the ground, slowly before thrusting their spear-like appendages that exist where their arms would be at her. Instinctively, Pearl almost dances, avoiding each incorporeal jab by the width of a hair before drawing her rapier and setting herself ready to fight. Noticing the inescapability of the conflict at hand, Aldrin ducks away from Pearl, running with wide berth between the strange assailants and himself to the other side of the square, pulling from his back a device made from a metal tube and a smooth wooden block. For a moment, Aldrin points the open end of the metal pipe toward the confrontation, aiming. Before, clenching his finger back on a metal switch, he causes a chain reaction, sending sparks erupting from the end near his hand and releasing a thunderous crash of fire and a large, billowing cloud of gray smoke from the open end, which fires a projectile at such a high speed it becomes invisible to the mortal eye. One of the forms nearest Pearl lunges forward toward her from the impact, letting a small, deformed metal orb fall through it to the ground. Before the shadow can turn to the source of its newest wound, a purple spherical burst of energy jolts out above the square, and Boop appears with a comical attempt at a fierce growl, sending energy from 2 of his eye stalks, one that would, to a living target, magically instill fear, and the other condensing the small amount of moisture in the air into snow along its path. Fearless, the shadow creature that exists beyond the death of its living shell turns to face the growling orb as frost forms across and through it like veins. The last of its movement is a struggle as it forces itself to face its attacker before freezing completely over and cracking into shards of ice which melt unnaturally fast, fading from existence. Fending off an onslaught of piercing thrusts untouched, Pearl returns the favor with a strike of her own through the neck of one of the shadow beings before her, which becomes motionless for just a moment before shifting to the side, passing the blade through its form with almost no resistance, as a trail of smoke appears to sweep steadily from the exit point. Pearl stops for a moment, baffled at the creature's defiance, almost positive it should be dead from that blow, opening herself up to be attacked from the side, which nearly happens as the other forms draw back and strike before being struck from its side by 2 arrows, again from the shadows. Turning, the shadow drops to and rushes across the ground as it wisps in the direction from which the projectiles sprang. 2 other shadows, completing their birth, join the others, darting across the ground toward Aldrin, rising next to him as he finishes filling the metal tube with a black powder and capping it with a small metal orb. 4 piercing forearms find their way into Aldrin's torso, emerging bloodless on the other side. No flesh is rent from him as a white and crimson energy is drained out from him into the 2 forms. Instinctively, he raises his left fist, on which another device rests, and bringing his hand to a button on its side, releases a spark and the end of a small tube, which bursts into an outwardly expanding gout of flame. The 2 forms writhe back, silently expressing their pain, and Aldrin falls from their clutches to his knees on the ground, suddenly feeling weak. The dragon's buffeting wings quiet as its momentous form vanishes into the distance beyond the walls of the town, apparently satisfied with the message sent. Still in immediate conflict, Pearl looks to the spot Elizabeth turned invisible, and slicing through the shadow's chest before her, she darts away from the spot, in hopes of drawing the creature away. Boop continues to bombard the shadowy aggressors with rays of energy, to not a significant effect as the initial blast, which had hit a target that had already been weakened by a barrage of other attacks. While releasing the energy to telekinetically shove one of the beings nearest Aldrin, Boop's eyes spot motion in the shadows where the third of the initial 3 beings darted to after being struck from the side. A human-like form leaps from the shadows, 2 blades drawn, slicing through the undead being several times. In the little bit of light present, his red skin stands out in contrast to the white powder of the ground. The newcomer's spiked orange hair, almost like a fire waving with the slashing motions of his strikes. His brown leather armor sits boringly plain, layered over his body, with the only noticeable personality on it being the gray fur padding stretched over the shoulders. Seeing Aldrin down, the stranger runs to help after striking his own assailant, but is struck across his back. The impact point immediately boiling and decaying from the touch, he still stumbles over as his strength is sapped from him. Pearl runs to the far end of the square, chased by the shadow, as Aldrin lifts his right arm, pulling a cord and launching 2 small projectiles, which upon making impact burst into flame of burning light, causing the shadow they impacted to draw away in unsettling silent pain. Retaliatorily, the 2 shadows lunge forward again for Aldrin, piercing through him once more, and again he falls as his strength leaves him, and the weight of his metal equipment becomes too much for him to lift. The stranger makes it to Aldrin, as the shadow he struck rises from the ground behind him, striking again. The agonizing blow from the life-draining shadow beings sap not only their victim's will to fight, but their strength as well. And with a second strike, the stranger is thrown to the ground, becoming like Aldrin, too physically weak to lift himself back up. From the ground, fighting to even keep their eyes open, the stranger and Aldrin look in terror as a new, horrifying form appears between them and the shadows, so frightening that even the shadows recoil from it. Pearl ducks past the shadow chasing her, stabbing through it with her rapier, avoiding its strike, acrobatically flipping over a low jab, and ducking below a swing aimed for her spine. Looking to where Elizabeth disappeared, Pearl witnesses in astonishment the young girl run for Aldrin as he falls. In the same moment the stranger falls to the ground, Elizabeth makes it to the men, and standing between them and their assailants, raises her hand out in defiance. The air around the young girl warps as from her the sound of tearing flesh and cracking bone drones for a second, before from her back a pair of black, skeletal wings free themselves, rending her flesh and sending a thin spray of blood onto Aldrin behind her. Extending out impossibly, the girl's black bone wings make a pseudo-wall between the sides of the conflict. Everything about Elizabeth thrums with an uneasy tension, as an unnatural fear instills itself into the shadows, Aldrin, and the stranger, with the dark energies surging through the young girl. Recoiling away, the three shadowy forms attempt to block Elizabeth's visage from their non-existent eyes, raising their piercing spear-like arms in front of their faces. From the skeletal wings protruding from her back, cold, dark energy surges down Elizabeth's arms, joining with energy that has begun forming flat disc-like sigils in front of her. And grasping the corporeal magic glyph, Elizabeth turns it in the air as if turning a valve. Amidst the withdrawing shadow creatures, a small tear in reality forms, appearing as a perfectly circular, black disk from all angles for a second, before bursting like glass as a flood of void blackness and twisting black milky tentacles pour forth as if the disk was a porthole shattered for a vessel submerged under water. The torrent surges toward all who see it as though flooding directly toward them. The black void, somehow darker than the lightless sky, pours out, filling a vast spherical area, 40 feet across, through the center, consuming all light and the shadows within, leaving those of the living and the shadow-pursuing Pearl beyond its cold, undulating surface. From within the area, strange, undiscernible whispers mutter maddeningly, with the slimy slapping of moist tentacles slurping across others. Joining Elizabeth, Boop begins a barrage of energy rays into the sphere, ensuring to telekinetically thrust one of the shadows back in as it attempts to escape. Over the course of the next minute, Elizabeth holds her fists clenched, the pulsating sigil in front of her rotating slowly as she focuses on maintaining the energy. Pearl dispatches her assailant with another few strikes, avoiding all counterattacks before it bursts into smoke, and the stranger and Aldrin struggle their way to a nearby wall where they prop themselves up. The short minute feels long as Pearl stands with the men by the wall, unable to help Elizabeth, being unable to see into the sphere, contemplating the small girl's wings' existence. The energy floating before Elizabeth flickers and fades as, like a complete reversal of how it came into being, the black, undulating, whispering sphere recoils in upon itself, vanishing into nothingness. At the same moment, the sigil shatters from Elizabeth's hands. In the space where the sphere had been, no shadow remains, as specks of dust are tossed softly onto a circular patch of stone, cleared completely of the sediment that had been there. Across the stone, small trenches and carvings are left, an unfathomably complex design of interfolding divots of cephalopodic appendages. With the energy that created the manifestation of the void present that was the sphere depleted, Elizabeth falls to her knees, breathing heavily. Boop quickly drops to Elizabeth's side before the small girl contorts in pain, as the large, cracking, black skeletal wings, each at least twice her height and span, draw back into her, pushing through her flesh and disappearing as though returning to a place within her that is not present in the third dimension she is viewed in. Pearl winces, watching Elizabeth scream in agony as though a limb were being sawed from her, but stands unable to think of any way she could help, and the men continue to avert their eyes, still uneasy with the lack of information on what the little girl actually is. Falling to her hands as the process of the protrusions retracting continues, despite her suffering, a process that comes to its end after a few long seconds, with the last glimpse of bone disappearing under her flesh. Elizabeth goes to stand, and with Boop's help, rises to face the three at the wall, softly saying, in a voice that tries to hide the residual throbbing of pain, "If that is what the dragon can do with a single breath, I think we should attempt the other path." Aldrin simply nods, a look of concern still plastered on his face. Pearl reaches out, stepping to Elizabeth, asking gently, "Lizzie, are you all right?" No sooner does the question leave Pearl's mouth when Boop's strength becomes not enough to support his master, Elizabeth's other side buckling under the strain of enduring such self-inflicted pain and producing forth such tremendous energy. Pearl catches Elizabeth as, looking to Aldrin, she explains, "I'm going to take her back to the house. Hurry up and regain your strength, and meet us there." Then, turning to the stranger, continues, "And you are welcome to join him. That is, you don't seem to be from around here, and would probably like to hear what Lizzie meant by other path." Pearl, Boop, and Elizabeth make their way out of the square, leaving the stranger, who turns to Aldrin as he pushes himself up the wall, trying to stand, and in a voice Aldrin would expect to hear from a dwarf, growls, "All right, you better start explaining. Why your companion just took monsters to your abode instead of killing it." Aldrin mimics the motion of forcing himself up with the grinding of metal joints, and looking to the stranger with an honest confusion of what he means, responds with a groan, "You mean Boop? Seems all right to me. Elizabeth treats it like a dog. I think he is akin to a pet for her." "Which one are you giving a name?" "What do you mean? Boop is the small, flesh-floating orb. I know it is weird, but..." Aldrin just rubs his chest before continuing, "I can deal with weird." Stabilizing himself to a stand, the stranger retains his look of concern, continuing, "What about the other one?" "Other one?" "Yeah, you can't be serious. The one with the wings." "Wait, you think the little girl is a monster? I mean, the wings were off-putting, but she did save us." "A monster's a monster, mate. Don't trust her longer than you can shoot that thing." The stranger points to the long metal tube at Aldrin's side. Aldrin straightens himself, picking up the gun, and shrugs before going to walk the way of the others. "Thanks for the concern. Are you going to go your own way now, or are you coming to hear about getting off this plane of existence?" "Might as well. Not sure how I got here, but this ain't the mortal plane. I'd love to get back to it." "You got a name?" "Auburn. Yours?" "Aldrin. Good to meet you, Auburn." Down the street, almost dragging her for some time, Pearl questions the sore, tired Elizabeth. "So, what was that back there? You didn't say you had wings in you?" With a smile as she tries to shift her weight onto her own legs, Elizabeth turns, replying, "You didn't ask. It's not something I have or would want to do often. I don't really control when they come out. To be honest, this was only the second time it's happened." "Well, it was pretty cool. What about that magic of yours?" "I'm not sure. My birth parents mentioned something when I was young about great power within me. Maybe that is what they meant?" "Well, if it is, and you can learn to use it, that would take a worry off my shoulders. You know, if Aldrin and I have already lost one friend in our travels. Trouble just seems to find us. So bringing along a child, especially one that can't protect themselves, would have kept me worried. I'm 13, not a child." "All right. Well, still, you're not quite an adult, but you have removed some worry from me of you coming along." In a moment of forgetfulness, Pearl playfully pats Elizabeth's back. Elizabeth winces with the sudden impact on the still sore area near her shoulder blades. Pearl quickly redraws her hand, apologizing. "Sorry, got caught up in the moment." And looking curious, at Elizabeth's back where the folded scar-like tissue was, from where the wings protruded. No sign of their emergence remains. The journey to the house is quiet after Aldrin introduces Auburn to the others. Words only of the next step to take pass through each of the 4 individuals' heads. With Pearl, Aldrin, Elizabeth, and Auburn at the table that breakfast was had on. Each one waits for another to speak, while Auburn keeps a keen eye trained on what appears as a little girl.